I'm just gonna come out and say it. I really had an incredible time with this game. It's a hell of a technical and artistic achievement. Expectations for one of the most highly requested remakes for one of the most beloved games in history were lofty, to put it mildly. Not to mention, Final Fantasy VII is my personal all-time favorite in the series and holds a very special place in my childhood, as I'm sure is the case with many others. There are many ways in which I found this game went above and beyond, but I do believe that this game will prove contentious among fans of the series, particularly where certain narrative decisions are concerned. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot to love about this title, even if you're new to Final Fantasy VII. It took me roughly 45 hours to finish the entirety of this title, and that includes the 24 or so side quests spread throughout the game's 18 chapters. Now, the elephant in the room is that Final Fantasy VII Remake is episodic, with Part 1 only encompassing the Midgar arc of the original title, which has left many wondering how the developers can justify dragging out the first few hours of the original game into dozens of hours in this remake. And I had concerns about this myself, but after experiencing all of the additional character development and world building this remake has to offer, after seeing how much they expand upon Midgar as a setting and all the story and character beats within this arc, I learned to live with it. I mean, obviously in an ideal world you'd have the entirety of Final Fantasy VII remade, but the sheer amount of manpower and resources and work that went into just this arc of Final Fantasy VII to just this part of the remake saga cannot be denied. It really is an extrapolation of everything you know, a really big expansion of that segment. I love how characters you kind of forgot about in the original, like Avalanche's Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, are much more fleshed out, and I actually found myself really caring for them in this iteration, with Jesse in particular being a show stealer. Beyond that, you also get to spend even more time with the core protagonists, whose personalities and interactions I think lie at the heart of this remake. Moments from the original represented by quips of text have evolved into fully fleshed out conversations conveyed via hours upon hours worth of immaculate cutscenes featuring breathtaking levels of graphical fidelity, impeccable animation, glee-inducing set pieces, and truly wonderful performances all around. You're not just reading what they're saying anymore, you get to hear the emotion in their voices, see it in their faces and body language, and there is room for scenes to breathe and tug at your heartstrings in ways that was just not possible in the original due to technical limitations. And all of this just enhances the emotionality of all of these moments and scenes and paves the road to some genuinely epic, touching, wholesome, and/or emotional scenes and gameplay sequences. There's also plenty of in-game dialogue and banter between characters that further develop their personalities and relationships. As a result, you get to know everyone better, buy more into their backstories, interactions, and relationships, and really grow fond of them. The writers did an incredible job here nailing the characterization of these beloved protagonists, giving them and the supporting cast plenty of moments to shine, doing justice to the source material while building upon that foundation in all the right ways. Villains also steal the spotlight on numerous occasions in this remake, with the Turks in particular, for me, being highlights. Some of the villains can admittedly feel very, mustache twirly and one-note, but generally speaking, they're given the right treatment, and they just feel more three-dimensional and more alive in ways that the original couldn't convey. There are also plenty of new characters who permeate this remake, from smaller side quest givers to key supporting cast, and honestly, many of them are really great and memorable and get to have their own moments too. With new characters also comes plenty of new story beats and scenarios for this remake, which, much like with the characters, uses the original as a framework, but also significantly extrapolates upon it. It's honestly really cool to see so many iconic moments or fan-favorite sequences from the original through such a visually and cinematically enhanced lens. Now, this isn't a one-to-one recreation of the original. There is a lot that's rearranged narratively, and while the remake does in large part retain key moments and follow key beats of the source material, and while it does mostly adhere to that framework, there are some major aspects of the original story that the developers took, shall we say, creative liberties with. I won't spoil specifics, but be warned that the finale in particular, while incredibly epic, veers completely off course, and I'll be curious to see what the fan discourse will be like surrounding its implications. I myself still don't quite know how to feel about it. I have to process and digest what happened. I'm still kind of scratching my head. But right now my feeling is that the left turn the game took at the end could end up unnecessarily complicating things for the future. That's all I'll say about that. You'll see what I mean once you get there. But putting that aside, know that while Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't the complete Final Fantasy VII story, it does feel like a complete package within the confines of this particular story arc and setting. The developers pulled all stops with this one and really poured everything they had into the characters, the presentation, the gameplay. There's just so many jaw-dropping scenario sequences and set pieces that left me gushing and left me wondering, holy crap, how much work did they put into this? Just when I thought that, that's the most epic this game can get, it seemed like the game kept topping itself. And I'm not just talking about the characters, the cutscenes. Beyond all that, this is just a really fun game to play. One of my fears was that the game might veer too much into action-oriented combat, but oh boy, is that not the case. There are plenty of encounters in this game that will kick your ass if you just rush in, and these more difficult encounters constantly force me to pause and take advantage of the action menu, analyze my enemies and surroundings, and strategically execute combat by switching between or commanding other characters and carefully choosing their targets for specific attacks, abilities, spells, or item usage, all while juggling limitations like the constantly refilling active time battle gauge that you must expend to perform actions outside of basic attacks, and the limited MP resource that enables usage of magic, which if you run out of, that's a significant detriment to combat scenarios given how many weaknesses you can exploit with magic. So yeah, small encounters aside, button mashing is plain and simply not a viable option, and preparation is paramount for long dungeons and some of the tougher encounters, and that's an aspect that I really appreciate. It's this fantastic blend of moment-to-moment action and this kind of tactical gameplay that JRPGs tend to demand. The game will constantly throw at you a wide variety and combination of enemies, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, and behaviors to assess, and that forces players to stay on their toes and put together the most well-rounded party possible. There are 4 playable characters total in Final Fantasy VII Remake: Cloud, Barret, Tifa, and Aerith, with only 3 of them being active at any one time, as dictated by the game's story. You don't switch them in or out. The story kind of takes you through that, and it'll find a way to separate certain characters to ensure there's a maximum of 3 characters in the party. And each of these characters play very differently from one another. Cloud is the frontline damage dealer, Barret is the long-range tank, Tifa is this agile melee combatant, and Aerith is the spellcaster and support cleric and healer. Separating all of these characters are their character-specific basic attacks and combos, special abilities that can be triggered with the triangle button, additional abilities that are unlocked as you find new, unique weapons for each of these characters, and of course their limit breaks. But there's an additional degree of universal customization for these characters in the form of materia, orbs that can be slotted into weapons and armor that grant everything from offensive elemental magic, buffs and debuffs, healing, powerful summons, to a number of other unique attributes. Materia slots will be limited starting out, but the game does feature a new weapons upgrade system that allows you to spend skill points that you earn by leveling up in order to unlock not only new materia slots, but also other passive enhancements to weapons like an increase in physical or magical damage, an increase in certain attributes, and more. The player gets to choose what they want to prioritize based on their playstyle and preference. Every weapon in this game is viable, which I really like, and every one of them has a skill tree that focuses on something specific. So one weapon skill tree might lean more towards increasing physical attack, another might focus more on magic, another might focus on a balance of the two, another might focus on having more materia slots, and there's another that might focus on dealing critical damage, so on and so forth. And then beyond character abilities, weapons, and materia, you've got armor and accessories that you'll earn or buy as you progress through the game, which you can equip to characters to grant extra defense, additional materia slots, and some other unique advantages. So there's a good amount of depth to the game's character progression, and as you continue to unlock new character abilities and have more materia options to play around with, and as difficulty in combat scenarios ramp up, you'll find that battles will be increasingly growing in depth and complexity. And yeah, they will kick your ass on occasions, and you'll have to really strategize and work around the information that you have by assessing enemies and using that information to exploit weaknesses and using the 3 characters in your party and synergizing them. It's pretty interesting stuff. There are some technical issues that prevent combat from being perfect though. The lock-on system can be finicky when there are too many enemies, camera can sometimes get in the way, aerial combat feels off and underdeveloped, the command menu doesn't allow you to command characters you aren't controlling to do basic attacks on specific targets or the triangle special attack on a target. You actually have to fully switch and control a character to do either of those things. And switching between characters isn't as instant as I'd like it to be and can feel a bit disruptive to the flow of combat, and unfortunately there's no way to assign priorities for AI-controlled characters and have them focus on, offense, defense, or healing, or whatever it is. There is this one materia called auto-healing, which makes an AI-controlled character heal a character when health is low, but that shouldn't be a materia, that should be an entire feature that's tied into the game, I feel. AI in general can be a little dumb here and there, sometimes not getting out of the way of devastating incoming attacks, or just not doing things that you'd expect them to do. They may not attack the target you want them to attack, among other things, and I just wish the AI had some semblance of customizability. Combat still is thoroughly enjoyable though, but there are some shortcomings that I mentioned that do result in occasional frustrations. Generally though, combat feels very satisfying, and it feels very fulfilling to overcome a tough battle through, just tactics and kind of patience and assessing your environment and using each character's strengths and the materia that they have equipped to the fullest extent. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't applaud the game's insanely epic boss battles, which are just spectacles to behold and play. Many of the boss encounters will be familiar to veterans of the original game, plenty of enemies that you'll recognize, and they're brought to life in just jaw-dropping fashion in the remake with incredible fidelity and animations, but there are also plenty of new bosses to look forward to as well. Whether this boss is a giant mech or creature, or whether you're engaged in a one-on-one fight with one of the superpowered villains, these boss battles are all in one way or another stunning and are definitely no cakewalk. Some of these can be pretty difficult and demand a lot of focus. And it's not just the quality of boss battles, I was also taken aback by the sheer quantity of bosses you fight in this game. There is a bunch of them, and each one seems to get more epic than the last. And these boss encounters feel pretty different from one another, with each having unique behaviors, types of attacks and attack patterns, strengths and weaknesses that require unique consideration. There was just clearly a lot of work that went into these bosses alone, and I wish I could talk about some of these, but that would spoil it, so I won't. But man, some of these boss battles are hype as fuck. And once you start pitting bosses against your own summons, shit can start looking pretty spectacular. Before fighting any boss though, you'll be making your way through the game's myriad dungeons, which serve to significantly extend scenarios from the original game. Dungeons typically consist of relatively simple, mostly linear environmental puzzles, and a bunch of combat encounters along the way. These dungeons comprise a pretty significant chunk of my 45 hours playtime, and they're fine. They're not the most intricate in level design per se, but I tend to enjoy encounters because of how fun the combat system is, with each dungeon introducing new enemy types, and the game distributes story beats, cutscenes, and character dialogue throughout these dungeons to keep players engaged. I do think that some of the dungeons are padded out too much though. Some dungeons can feel like they outstay their welcome through repetition of puzzles and barrages of encounters, but they always end with insanely epic boss battles battles or story developments that make it all worthwhile. Outside of dungeons, during more peaceful segments of the game, you'll be traversing through interconnected sectors of the gorgeously realized Midgar. Seeing Midgar and its various landmarks with such a high level of graphical fidelity and attention to detail, it really is something else. Each sector acts as a hub area where you'll be able to rest, buy items and weapons, partake in optional side quests during specific chapters of the game, and even play the occasional minigame. And of course, plenty of main campaign chapters take place in these sectors as well. Now, as far as side quests go, there are about 24 of them, and these side quests are pretty rudimentary, mainly involving fetch quests and monster killing quests, encompassing roughly 10 hours of my total playtime. And yeah, they're pretty simple, not the most compelling of activities, but they do present a cast of quirky side characters and denizens of Midgar that provide much needed flavor to the setting and levity through some wholesome or really silly moments. Final Fantasy VII Remake's sense of humor was a really pleasant surprise. On a number of occasions, I found myself laughing out loud at some of the dialogue, interactions, and scenarios presented both during the main campaign and side quests, and there are some really quirky elements in this game that at times remind me of the Yakuza series, if that makes any sense, and I for one love that. Now, none of that comes at the detriment of the serious moments in Final Fantasy VII Remake. Those who've played the original will know that there are pretty tragic aspects to this Midgar story arc, and with how the game brings the city to life with meticulous attention to environmental details, how it encourages you to interact with denizens and learn about life in the slums, and how it fleshes out both core and supporting characters in such a more expansive way, I was that much more invested in the city, its people, and the ongoing conflicts. It all made me feel that much more for certain tragic events, and the collateral damage that's conveyed in ways that the original game could not capture or present. Midgar is also host to a number of jaw-dropping vistas. I cannot tell you the number of times I've just stopped to soak in a scenery or stopped inside a building to soak in the impressively furnished and detailed interior. There's also a constant sense that this world is lived in thanks to all of these macro and micro environmental details. Crowds of NPCs reacting with dialogue about current events and recent goings-ons as you walk by them, stuff like that are a great touch. And things like the effort put into background crowd animations, stuff like that I really appreciate and really helps the world feel more alive, like it's a real place. And then there's the music. My God, the music. The orchestrated rendition of iconic Final Fantasy VII tunes are nothing short of sublime, and there are plenty of new soundtracks that offer a different take on familiar melodies, remixes of familiar songs, or that flat out present entirely new music, and all of it is heavenly. The music in Final Fantasy VII Remake is nothing short of a masterpiece, and I think it's half of why scenes and sequences in this game have the impact that they do. I find that there is just so much to love about Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's in so many ways such a remarkable package, full of heart, and a pure labor of love on the developer's part. Just the sheer number of incredibly detailed and animated and gorgeous cutscenes alone says a lot about how much work was involved in the creation of this game. But then you look at some of the incredible gameplay sequences and set pieces, or the nuanced moments found in the more low-key or emotional or touching or wholesome scenes and interactions. And that's when you realize what took so long to make this game. Now, there is bound to be some contention about some of the narrative divergences and implications. I think combat could have used more refinements here and there, although overall, again, it's very fun and satisfying and impactful feeling. I do wish AI was customizable in some way, and I do think that there are some dungeons and some gameplay moments that feel too padded out. But none of that ultimately detracts from my belief that this is a very special game with some incredible highlight moments, a lot of highlight moments that left me gleeful. I smiled and laughed at the game's lighthearted and quirky moments. I was just hyped and cheered for some of the iconic and epic ones. I sighed in relief when I overcame some really tough encounters that kicked my ass a couple times. And most of all, I felt for these familiar and beloved characters who I grew up with and now I got to know even better. There are lingering questions about Square Enix and how they'll pull off Part 2, how much more of the full story that will encompass from the original, how long it'll take to make given Part 1 took this long, how newly introduced story elements in Part 1 will work and weave into familiar beats that players will expect in Part 2. So yeah, there's still a lot of questions about the future of the Remake series, but this Part 1 of the remake certainly left me wanting more while also leaving me very satisfied with what we got. I'm ultimately glad that this remake got made. It's something that so many people asked for, and I think Square Enix really did this endeavor, this ambitious and just, terrifying endeavor, really, when you consider the legacy of Final Fantasy VII. I think they did it justice, generally speaking, even if certain story beats might prove controversial among the fan base. And that's all I gotta say about that. Thank you for tuning in, folks. That's one man's review of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are about this game if you end up playing it, and what your expectations are. And to be further updated on more video game reviews, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.